I love Thursdays when I'm not here in the lecture. It's fantastic. I wake up in the morning and I'm not there. And the sun's shining and I don't care. So nice to be Thursday morning. Everybody sign up, please. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ted Byfield here. He is, like many of us doing this job, perfectly qualified for the task in that he holds a BA in Asian Studies from Columbia University. Can't think of a better foundation doing something like this. My regards for Ted in Parsons is that he thinks now in the university that's supposed to be universal activity. It's not. The most depressing aspect of a few years I spent teaching at Harvard was that before I went there I thought everybody must be an extraordinary intellect and thinking very hard. I didn't think that almost everybody there was a very high intellect. I thought very few people there thought. But thinking is infinitely rarer than it's that intellect and infinitely more to be valued. He's currently visiting fellow on the Information Society program at Yale University. Not encountered him. He's assistant professor in communication design, and means really hanging about the 12th floor. He worked for over a decade as a freelance book editor for a variety of presses ranging from Cambridge University, Dear Centre for the Arts, New Press, Scribner, and Zone Books. Served as an editor of ICA, a Dublin Watch, co-moderator of the Neckline mailing list, editing two of its proceedings called Read Me in 1999 and NKBBI in 2001. Co-organized several conferences, notably Chulipolmania in 2000, Blurdo 2 in 2002, and Next 5 Minutes 4 in 2003. He's written on subjects ranging from space photography to internet governance. They've appeared in publications as diverse as First Monday, Frise, Le Monde Diplomatique, and Mute Magazine. He's consulted for the BBC, The Kitchen, the Open Society Institute, and the WAG Society for Old and New Media. Awards and honours. He was a contributing member to the winner of the 1997 Rotterdam Design Prize, a 2002 Design Trust for Public Space Fellowship in Journalism, 2003 grant from the Open Society Institute, and a contributor in 2003-04 to the Social Science Research Council's Information Technology and International Cooperation Work. Current areas of interest include the etymology of words central to describing the rise of ICT functions, the ways in which social discourses are expressed through technical interfaces, alternatives to privacy, and the subject is directed to today's lecture, critical perspectives on data visualization, the realm of visualization and ideology, its relationship to designing. So, please welcome Ted.
Can you hear me okay? Good voice? Okay. On top of that, well, I should say that I'm no longer affiliated with Yale. That was for 2 years, but thank you very much for that nice introduction. I should also say that I'm deliriously ill today. I spent the past 2 or 3 days working on this presentation in a very different state of mind, so we'll see how it goes, and we'll see how my voice holds up. Anyway, I've given different versions of this talk for design for this century. Over the past, this will be the third one. And in the past, I've called it things like against tough design. I'll explain what that means in a minute. But I feel like the utility of that name is waning a bit. So my goal in reshaping the talk this time has very much been my focus in terms of leading the recitation section for this course, which is to make these ideas really as useful for you as possible. I'm not really sure how to do that with these ideas, because in many ways these ideas are more sort of critical than they are sort of like, technical in their orientation. So anyway, here you go. We hear a lot about the information society, information age, information this, information that, and it's very much associated with futurity. In fact, it really shouldn't be. The word's been kicking around for about 800 years and has been rolling across a number of fields ranging from literature to the law, physics, genetics, and accumulating all of these meanings to the point where it's really become kind of hopeless in its vagueness. It's running behind this Kent, which is a doff of the hat to the documentary Adam Curtis, is an IBM ad that depicts this sort of world that's creating and radiating information. But really, for the most part, I think it often means stuff you can't touch. Along with ideas of information, we see that we closely associate ideas of chaos and complexity. This is a diagram that shows the frequency of English language books published with either one or the other of those terms, and you can see that chaos is kind of a stalking horse for complexity. And you can see in particular that there was a sort of rising interest in it from the 60s on, and that it's kind of gotten out of control here. The notion that information is associated with chaos, I think, is a very interesting one, because chaos as well is both a very ancient word and in some ways a very new word, as is complexity. Now, the focus of the subject isn't so much these ideas as it is the ways that we perceive them. And what I'm doing is I'm talking about these things. You've seen them all. These are the sort of more fetishized examples of these sort of information design, data visualization. In many ways, I think it's a very sort of tiresome field. There's enormous amounts of intimidation and lack of clarity at work. But less than the sort of fetishized versions of them, I also very much mean the sort of the daily presence of graphs and charts that we see every day, all the time. And it's quite remarkable that they've slowly pervaded every aspect of our life, from sort of utility bills to every interface that you ever deal with, to the news, without so much comment on what this is as a genre. But when I was talking about this with a friend of mine years ago, he suggested, and I think correctly, that there basically isn't a significant decision that's made in this world at this point without reference to one of these devices. I'm trying to look at them in the way that, for example, an art historian would look at art or something like that as a kind of a cultural artifact. There are various and sundry sites which you may or may not know that sort of bill themselves as being very eclectic and showing you all these kinds of things. This one, Visual Complexity, was founded by a D4TC graduate, Manuel Lima. I hope that he will forgive me for some of the critical remarks that I make about his work, because I really know what personally intended. This one, Information is Beautiful, run by David McCandless, I think is probably one of the best examples of this sort of fetishizing tendency. This sort of this fanatical drive to sort of reduce information and give it some kind of visual face that we can understand. These devices go under various names. You can see them here, so I don't need to read them. Some of these things refer to particular fields. For example, scientific visualization. And we have to be very careful about accepting this new terminology that we hear to use these things. There's nothing intrinsically scientific about a diagram, any more than there's something intrinsically scientific about a guy wearing a lab coat in a gallery. It's just not. Instead, what we're doing is looking at sort of a visual form and looking at its history and trying to understand what it is and where it comes from and how it works and the kind of impact that it has. I think one of the nicest terms that I've seen actually is explanation graphics, which I believe is from the late 70s or early 80s. So if we try to define them in terms of disciplines, for example, science or journalism or art or something like that, we very quickly get sucked into these specialized discourses that sort of tend to pull them apart and try to impose their own sort of normative disciplinary values on them. So instead what I try to do is to define them in terms of certain formal properties. So for example, they have quasi-mathematical figures that are represented in an empty space. that empty space is somehow qualitatively different and unstructured. It might appear just to be the blank white page behind it or something like that, but it's always important to ask what the background is. You never really know who the observer is. There's this kind of monocular vision that's imposed on them. You're looking at it, but you don't really know from where you are in that space. And by sort of not disclosing the nature of your relationship to the object, you can sneak in all kinds of different political and cultural agendas. They're hybrid. You can absorb almost anything. For those of you who have a background in literary theory, I would argue that this is a sort of visual equivalent of a Bakhtinian dialogic discourse. For those of you who don't have that background, never mind. And finally, it's important to note that the visual language that they use is incredibly reductive. It's basically dots, lines, and colors. It's really all it is. You can dress them up however you want, but that's about it. Here are some of the problems with these things. I'm going to lay this out up front, and then I want you to keep this in mind as I'm going through this talk. They typically use level, stable, proportional, almost kind of Neoplatonic squares and circles or so on that suggest that the data is sort of containable and manageable, like little bird cages for chaos to sort of exist in. Again, you'll see a reference to that later. I'm going to give you one simple example of what I mean, and then I'll move on. This refers to, in some ways, to the prehistory of this kind of informational discourse. This is a kinetoscopic record of a man sneezing. It was taken by Thomas Edison around the turn of the century. It's quite a fantastic image. Here's an image roughly contemporary with that, which was a cartoon by Winsor McKay, the man who effectively invented animation, showing much the same thing, but showing as well very neatly what I'm talking about here, the ability of the sort of frame to contain the discourse or vice versa. The argument that I'm making here is that we need to be very careful about these images for the simple reason that I think that very few of you will ever benefit from being visualized. Right? I don't know how to be clearer than that. So, for every stated variable, there are infinite undefined variables. That means that we're examining 2 or 3 things, but for those 2 or 3 things are all cultural constructions, historical constructions, that as such are totally arbitrary. They may be good or bad, but that's what they are. Again, there's a sort of question of the position of the observer, which is sort of obscured by the pseudo-optics. Things like the timelines and the scales and the matrices that are presented exist sort of on the same plane of truth as the data. It's very rare that you'll sort of see a situation where the data, they clearly say, this is a completely arbitrary framework and here's a bunch of data, and they have nothing to do with each other at all. And so, for example, you'll see time is always presented in terms of like months, years, days, but you'll very rarely see seasons or biographies or weeks or periods of life, the sort of absolutely fundamental ways of understanding time that are not so amenable to computation. So anyway, here's another example. This is a screen grab from an RSA animation that was done of Manuel Lima's talk, in which I think he, with the best of intentions, reveals some of the worst tendencies of these kinds of things. Here he's arguing that because you can draw pictures of a mouse's neural structure and of the structure of the universe, that somehow he's discovered some secret universal structure, right, which he then goes on to argue is a network. Now, a network ain't nothing but a bunch of dots that are attached to each other. So, to a certain extent, if you say that everything is the same, you will conclude that everything is the same. I think that the point here is that what we need to understand is that everything is always different. And the most ideological claim that you can ever make in this world is to reduce something to sameness. So anyway, here's below that, as the animation goes on, you'll see what I mean by the sort of sneaking in of a bunch of sort of traditional tropes. Here we have genius, here we have a Renaissance man, here we have biological sort of taxonomies like specializations for insects, right, on the bottom right. And on the bottom left, you see some mumbo-jumbo about collective intelligence. And very much, I was under the impression that people were beginning to reevaluate things like biological taxonomies and beginning to look at things like bees and ants as though they might form a different kind of mind that you can learn from. But here we see, no, that's just for them. Right? And then you'll see this sort of beautiful image of a guy in a balloon hovering over some cartographic representation. Right? Again, fantastic images that feel like they kind of peeled out of maybe Vermeer or some like, David painting. And most of all, at the center of this, what you'll see is something that I think is very key, and that's the notion of what I call a kind of a geometric imagination. That every society you ever encounter in this world has a sense of aesthetic balance, things that belong together and things that don't belong together, hierarchies. And I think that one of the big problems that people are trying to address now is that since we don't really know when we are, and we don't really know where we are, we feel as we're very much out of control. And that one of the main uses of these images is to try to establish a sort of a visual framework where we can look to them, look and find the world to be reassuring. This is a quotation from a guy named Sandy Pentland, who's a relatively prominent comp sci guy at MIT. He calls himself a data scientist. The more I read this quotation, I think he's like a complete fanatic, raging guy. He says here that the ability to see the details of markets and of political revolutions and to be able to predict and control them says a great deal about what his political agenda is. The other thing that he doesn't say, because he apparently doesn't know it, is that when he says that we can finally look at the details and social interactions and how they play out, he seems to be ignorant of the fact that there's something called history, which people have been doing for as long as there's recorded history. And some of that work is truly remarkable. The idea that suddenly we can look at stock markets and then we'll truly understand what's going on. This is madness. This is absolute madness. I'm sorry, Mr. Denman. Okay. Now, to explain the kind of less than useful title of this talk, it refers to a guy by the name of Edward Tufte, who until pretty recently was one of these sort of, a name that you could barely sort of smurf around the net for 5 minutes without running across. His name was invoked as a banner of all that is great and visual and having a sort of great and sort of elegant and clear visual design. He's a strong advocate of what he calls a data-ink ratio, the idea that you should spend as little ink as possible encoding as much information as possible. That's fine. It's also, I think, in some ways a very kind of like, strongly low Protestant view. There's a lot of sort of Scotch thrift embedded in that, that I think is a little bit problematic. But anyway, Tufte's impact seems to be on the wane. I think that he imagines himself much like this figure of the connoisseur in this Norman Rockwell painting, which is really a true masterpiece. Right? You don't often think of Mr. Rockwell as a genius, but I think he actually is. Here, this man whose physical posture, and all of his outward trappings show very clearly that he's a sort of man of taste and elegance, confronting the specter of modernity, this sort of incredible, like self-indulgent excess and waste and sort of madness, and yet contained within a frame and standing very beautifully on this kind of distended, sort of grid. It's quite fantastic painting. I think that this is in some ways how Tufte imagines himself to be. He has a number of books. I've taken him at his word and used a proportional type size to indicate the utility of his books. The first one's with reading. By the time you get to the end, you can pretty much ignore it because it's the same stuff over and over and over. Anyway, again, like everyone in the world, I'm sure he's a very nice guy, but he's very dedicated to this. His books are these lavishly illustrated things that show that kind of greatest hits, like K-Tel greatest hits of information design from this culture, from that culture, from this period and that period. But one of the things that's very odd about them is that what's terribly missing from his work is any kind of a historical narrative. So on the one hand, he's sort of hoovering up the best of in order to establish a sort of a discourse and argue for ways of approaching it. On the other hand, he's doing total historical violence to every single thing that he encounters and producing a sort of a new form. And central to my argument, I'm not going to dwell on this too much because I don't really have time, is that this field's inability to historicize itself, its inability to accept the failures and the historical determinations that made this object this way or that object that way, is very much of a piece with what is going on. And that we need to understand these things as historical instruments, and in particular historical instruments of the state and of corporations. Very few people visualize themselves without internalizing these kinds of things. Tufte is mainly known in banner form for this category that he calls chart junk. And this is the idea that if you're sort of populating your visualizations or representations with arbitrary metaphors or pictures or this or that, he thinks that this is awful, that this should be banned from the face of the earth. I think, on the contrary, this is a desperate struggle that people are undertaking in order to find themselves in these new conceptual spaces and actually to sort of take control of them again as much as they can. These are two quite beautiful, in their different ways, images of this sort of like this catastrophic decline surrounding the global meltdown of 2008. And in particular, what you can see is that the spaces themselves have been converted into objects within a larger human narrative. One of the curious things about Tufte is that no one seems to disagree with him. I haven't updated these searches in a while, but it's kind of unbelievable. It's not possible. You're not allowed to disagree with it in any way, shape, or form. It is always right. Right? This is really crazy. It's completely unbelievable. It's very much why, I mean, again, it's nothing personal. It doesn't really have to do with him. It has rather to do with the use of his name as a kind of an ideological banner in a certain kind of practice. Okay. So I'm going to move on. This is a little bit closer to home. A quotation from Ben Fry, who's one of the co-authors of the Processing Visual Language, which some of you are familiar. It's a fantastic quotation, which is at the very opening of his dissertation that he turned into an august group of people at MIT. So he says this.
I can find that
well, as I said, I hadn't updated the search in about a year or so. So anyway, so basically one of the opening sentences of Fry's dissertation says this, and there's only one problem. It's not true. Not only is it not true, it's completely unverifiable. And not only is it unverifiable, it doesn't mean anything. This is a pure ideological statement, right? And I'll show you why. There's three different ways to interpret his statement. Right? There's our ability to collect, store, and manage. We'll call that a blue line. We'll use these tools against the master. Then there's a red line. That's our ability to understand data. Right? So there are three different ways that you can map that. In the first one, you could say that our ability to understand data is there's sort of different ways of approaching it in which they sort of like coincide or don't coincide. So the first model is sort of an optimistic model, and that is we have a long way to go before trouble happens. The second one, we were completely screwed to begin with, and we could never understand all the data that we were faced with. And the third one suggests that at some point there's going to be a collision between what we can produce and what we can understand. The problem, as with many of these things, is that we don't know where we are in these narratives at all. We could be very, very close to the x-axis, or we could be way off in right field. Right? We don't know. So we don't know when we are in history. We don't know when we are in these histories. All we